very much, Rick. Now I'm going to ask Mark and Pete and Rick to sit up on our science panel. And what I'd like to do is open it up to questions for you. We can open up, we have kelp forest on our far left in our title and deep offshore. And I think, the concepts are really similar across all of the different ecosystems. We're looking at how we can actually detect the effects of these new marine protected areas. So feel free to ask any of our panelists a question. Anybody? Nobody has a question? Okay. Do you want to state your name so we know who you are?
My name is Eric, and I have a question. I know that you go out and count things and assess things, but what happens when you find something that totally throws you off? I mean, do you ever come to a situation and say, we anticipate finding this, and we found that, and can you do research to find out why you came up with something you didn't expect? Does that even make sense?
Sure, yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to... can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So the question was, what do we do when we find patterns that we didn't predict or expect to see? And we haven't gotten to many cases of that yet, because essentially in most of these cases we've just done the baseline as opposed to actually see changes that we would interpret are related to the protected areas. But we actually anticipate a lot of unanticipated results. And in large part it's because what these protected areas do is they just protect a particular component of the ecosystem, those species that are being fished. And how the rest of that ecosystem is going to respond depends on how those fish species interact with everything else in the system. We don't have great understanding of how many of the species interact with other species and influence the rest of that ecosystem. So, for example, certainly we wouldn't expect all fish to increase in abundance in a protected area, because some of those fish that are going to, in fact, many of those fish that we expect to increase are going to turn around and eat other fish, and we predict a reduction in their abundances. But to get to your final point, when we see some of these patterns that we wouldn't have predicted, that then becomes the fodder for doing more research, to better understand and why we saw those responses that we didn't predict. Which unfortunately is left for the graduate students, because we don't get to do that.
Okay, there was a question in the back.
Yeah, it was very similar question, because if I understood Mark correctly, you're only counting a preset list of species. So my question was, well, what if one of the impacts is that another species becomes dominant when you're not even looking at it? But you kind of already answered that.
Yep. Here, I'll let Rick follow up on that.
Actually, for the submersible work and for the fishing, we count everything.
Yeah,
and the same thing for Mark.
There.
But the real interesting thing is occasionally we'll see distributions or a species that shouldn't be there in large numbers, but it is. And that's what we really want to spend our time looking at. But we don't have, as Mark said, graduate students tend to have that fun.
Okay, we'll take the gentleman in the back. Do you want to state your name and where you're a docent? And maybe you guys could get to know each other a little bit.
I'm Mike Davis, docent at Fitzgerald Marine Reserve. And my question was, does the Act permit the reintroduction of any depleted species, or would that screw up the science program?
The Act doesn't speak to the reintroduction of anything. It's just for the protection of the species that are currently there.
Okay, the woman in purple.
Hi, my name is Lauren. I work for Save Our Shores. And I just had a question about the tagging. What's the percent of tags that you put out compared to how many you're getting back? And has that been successful to get outreach to all the fishermen to say, if you catch one of these, give us back the tag? And things like that.
Yeah. In any tagging, we tag 80 or 90% of the fish we catch. And in any tag or capture study, if you get 5 or 6% back, you count that as a tremendous success. We're down at about 2 or 3% right now, but that's primarily because half the areas we're tagging are reserves where you're not supposed to go. Yes, we have pretty good response. It's always great if you could pass the word to give us a call if you do find a tagged fish, though.
Okay, gentlemen here.
Yes, just a question about shark finning. How close to our coast does that occur, if at all, or is it all in some distant part of the world, Asia, really, whatnot?
Yeah, my understanding is that shark finning doesn't occur anywhere in the United States. Certainly not legally, certainly not within U.S. territorial seas. There are areas in the world that's real common.
So there's 0 to 200 nautical miles is within the U.S. and it's illegal to do shark finning within those areas. It doesn't mean that it doesn't occur illegally. So there have been some instances, especially off of other places like off of Hawaii and Southern California, where there's less enforcement and more proximity to a lot of those international operations. In the back?
I have a question about the Rocky Intertidal. About the Rocky Intertidal? Yes. I noticed that you referred to PISCO and that I know about the lipids program. Have you had any involvement with that? Are you making any use of that?
Yeah, there's a couple of responses to that. The question was about the relationship between PISCO and lipids. When lipids was first formed about 1999 or 2000, PISCO worked with them extensively to work on their protocols and compare between the protocols. In the north central coast, where Mark and I are both working right now in terms of the monitoring, which extends from about Onion River to the north, there's a formal interaction between PISCO, between the monitoring that is being done in the intertidal by us and between the lipids program itself. So they're quite collaborative and quite interactive.
Just to follow up with that, for those of you who don't know, the Lipids program is a marine education program for stakeholders and volunteers right in the intertidal zone to actually do monitoring.
I'll also follow that up. There's a sort of parallel program in the kelp forest monitoring effort. There's a group called Reef Check, which also is a program that brings recreational divers into the monitoring effort. They actually go through a pretty rigorous training program, and then those volunteers are actually involved in monitoring the protected areas, both in the Central Coast and in the North Central Coast. And like Pete's program, we've worked closely with that group to develop their training and their sampling.
And Mark is recruiting a volunteer operation to do the scuba diving up in Anyo with him. So jump on in. Is there another question? Yes, here.
Bob from Seacliff. How secure is your funding for future studies? I know you use grad students and so forth, but we have a variety of groups. How far out can you go?
Yeah, as Mark and Rick and I have all alluded to, the initial baseline monitoring was funded by Sea Grant, but through the monitoring enterprise, essentially. And that was for a 2-year period. Subsequent funding has been arranged, it's been cobbled together really from different sources, but not directly from the state, of course, from the monitoring enterprise. So in terms of the baseline, it's secure. It will be done for the north central, it will be done for the south, and it will be done for the north. For the long-term monitoring, there is no basis for funding at this point.
Yes?
Hi. So you did baseline monitoring in 2007 and 2008. And so how frequently will you be going out and doing like long-term monitoring? Like every 3 years or 5 years?
That's going to depend upon the group, and so I can only comment for the Rocky Intertidal. Rocky Intertidal received baseline monitoring funding for 2007 and 2008. We have some additional funds that came from the Packer Foundation to do certain monitoring along the Central Coast, but it was not directly related or tied to assessment of the MPAs. We're hoping that there's going to be future funding. It's not at all clear that there will be, that it comes from the state itself. Mark and Rick can talk about their program.
And we have received foundation support to continue the kelp forest monitoring over the first 5 years. Again, with the intent of sort of a prolonged baseline survey, because what you do with that initial time series is get a better feel for the rate at which things are changing, which will then also give you an idea of how frequent or how often you need to go out to survey through time. So we have had support over the initial 5 years to sort of develop those trajectories, and that'll end in another year after next summer, at which point we'll be in a position where we can identify how often do we really need to go out and survey these sites on into the future.
Yes.
I'm Lori from Seacliff, and I just wondered your relationship with Fish and Game. Are they giving you, number one, are they giving you much feedback on whether they catch people or not? And then if they do they turn over fish to you that have been taken, poached, whatever you want to say? When you're out on a boat, there are no buoys that identify where it is and where it isn't. So I'd like a better understanding of how people that are fishing, for instance, if we can even add to that information, the people who are visiting, may go out fishing, may ask, well, how do you designate where you can and where you can't?
Dennis?
If I could just maybe make one introduction and then insert him into the conversation. Captain Don Kelly is with us from the Department of Fish and Game and responsible for the field wardens and MPA enforcement in this stretch of the coast. So perhaps he can weigh in on any of these questions that the scientists would like to defer to him.
Let me just make one comment first. There was a question, I think, in Caitlin's presentation that talked about enforcement and the lack of funding for enforcement. And from our point of view, which is rocky or tidal, since the MPAs went into place in Central California, our people are getting stopped way more often. And that's a good thing. I really think that's a good thing because there's been a lot more vigilance. I don't know whether they've devoted more resources or more attention, but irrespective, there's been a lot more vigilance in the part of Fish and Game, at least with respect to the rocky or tidal areas. They constantly are checking us for our permits, make sure that we're out there doing the right thing and not collecting things like abalone and other things that we're not supposed to be.
Don, did you want to respond to the question? Or?